Hello, everybody, and welcome to the TeacherCast Educational Network. My name is Jeff Bradbury. Thank you so much for joining us today and making TeacherCast your home for professional development. This is Digital Learning Today, episode number 31. Today, I have a guest on today from the Clarke Schools for Hearing and Speech, and we're going to talk about how you can support your students who have some difficulties in the auditory fields. I want to bring on today my good friend, Nell Rosenberg. Nell, how are you today? Welcome to TeacherCast.
I'm great, thank you. How are you doing, Jeff?
It is so good to see you today. Thank you so much for coming on. I am excited about this topic. You know, we're talking today all about the Clarke Schools for Hearing and Speech. Talk to us a little bit about the organization. I know there's multiple campuses. I know you guys are doing some amazing things for students all around the world. How are you today, my friend?
Yeah, I would love, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm very happy to share all about Clarke's mission and specifically Teleservices. But Clarke has been serving children who are deaf and hard of hearing, who are learning listening and spoken language for over 150 years. And we've transitioned a lot in that time. We started out as a boarding school in Massachusetts. We no longer are a boarding school at all. We have day school programs in 4 different states where children come for early intervention and preschool services and sometimes kindergarten and beyond. We have robust mainstream services where our professionals are going into schools as children get older. And then we have a huge Teleservices program that's growing by the day. So we can serve children who are using that listening technology, whose families may not have access to really specialized professionals in their geographic area. Now we can reach them absolutely anywhere across the United States and even around the world.
Now, working with students who have these types of needs, that's something that you've been doing for a long time. Tell us a little bit about your background and how do you fit into the whole Clarke school system?
That's a great question. I always knew I wanted to work with children with special needs. I got my master's in early childhood special education, and I loved it, but it wasn't quite the right fit for me. I didn't love being with a large group. I really liked being in small groups and individual. So I went on to get a master's in communication sciences and disorders and became a speech language pathologist. And in that time, I was so fortunate to have an incredible instructor who was an auditory verbal therapist, which is what I am now. It's a very specialized thing you do after you get your speech degree to become focused on listening and spoken language. So children whose families want them to use hearing technology and to listen and speak. Many of our families also learn ASL or another sign language, and we support that, but that's not our specialty. It's not what we do at Clarke. So I was fortunate to get that opportunity. I did my last externship at Clarke's Jacksonville, Florida campus. I absolutely fell in love with it. I ultimately moved to New York City, where I became a speech pathologist at Clarke, New York, and later the assistant program director there. And at that time, we got a large grant to explore Tele-Services back when that was not really done. Long before COVID, when we were really having to convince parents, like, yeah, we're going to get on FaceTime and we're going to do therapy with your baby. So we did not know what we were doing. We were learning as we went, but I fell in love with it. And I started coordinating the program at that campus. And ultimately, I relocated and became the national director of Teleservices for all of Clarke's campuses. And I do outreach anywhere.
Now, I'm going to talk to you today as the podcast host, but I'm just going to warn you, sometimes I slip into father of special needs students therapy sessions here as we kind of go through at this.
That's my wheelhouse. I love working with parents.
Okay, so my first question is simple. If you are a family who has a student that has hearing needs, correct me if I'm saying the wrong words here, what are some of the things that a parent can do to support their students with or without the help of Clarke?
That's a great question. Typically, we say students who are deaf or hard of hearing. Some people say students with hearing loss or hearing impairment. Those are typically the terms we use. And we sometimes shorten that to DHH for deaf and hard of hearing because it's wordy. What parents can do, it's a low incidence disability and there's mandatory screening at birth. So this is a diagnosis that many parents are getting. They get that screening and they sometimes get the diagnosis if things go well as early as a couple weeks of age. So we're talking about very, very young babies. Now, sometimes we have later diagnoses, but in many cases, we're working with parents who are brand new parents, or they have a brand new baby and an older kid where this didn't happen at all. And typically there's no family history of hearing loss. Sometimes there is, but this is a really, really shocking diagnosis for most families we work with. And the families are put into a very challenging situation where they have, I'm sure you experienced some version of this, about 5 million appointments to coordinate. And they're at this intersection of working with medical professionals and educational professionals with a tiny infant. And it's very hard to take that all in. So what I would say parents can do first and foremost is to remember that bond between parent and child is foremost, and to enjoy being a parent, to try to take a step back and enjoy your baby every moment you can, and to find that support system that works for your family. So you might have to try out some different teams, and you might have to try out some different professionals. You might not click with one doctor. Keep trying. If your child is deaf or hard of hearing, I would strongly encourage you to reach out to Clarke, regardless of where you live. If you live near another wonderful program, I will tell you that right away. We get calls like that sometimes, and I'll say, oh my gosh, we have amazing colleagues down the road from you. Let me connect you. And you'll have a lot of decisions to make. Do you want to pursue hearing technology and listening and spoken language? Do you want to pursue ASL or sign language? Do you want to do both? And it's about finding people that can support your family and what you want. So you want people who are giving you information that is not biased, information that is clear and accurate, and supporting you in your decisions. If you feel like you're working with someone who is supporting you in what you feel is right for your child, you've found your team.
Now, you mentioned that Clarke offers Teleservices. Talk to us a little bit about what those are. How do those work? And does everybody qualify for something like that?
That's a great question. Anyone who is deaf or hard of hearing from birth all the way through college, so through the end of high school, they can do T-Visit Teleservices with Clarke. Now, we do them through a variety of different funding methods. Families can private pay, but we do have needs-based financial aid available. We also do contract with individual schools, with districts, with all kinds of LEAs is what most people say. So there's a lot of different options for families. But yes, we work with families in a lot of states, in a lot of countries, with babies who are 2 weeks old, with kids who are 20 years old and finishing up high school. And what it looks like changes a lot, as you can imagine, over the years.
Do many young infants that have been diagnosed as having hearing loss, full-term NICU babies?
Good question.
How early is this? I'm only asking. My kids were 25 weeks, so I have a lot of these questions popping out, right?
Yes, it is more common with NICU babies and with prematurity. It is. However, in general, it's kind of an unbiased diagnosis. So we see it pretty equally across genders, hits all ethnicities and, ethnic backgrounds, all of those things. There are certain kinds of hearing loss, like certain syndromes or certain malformations in the ear that may be more common in a certain population, in certain countries of origin, or in prematurity or that kind of thing. However, any child can be born with a congenital hearing loss.
And you mentioned that the T-Visit Teleservices are for children of all ages. You had mentioned as young as, 2 weeks.
Yeah.
How does that work? Is that a video-based service? Is that something that can happen in the hospital if needed?
Yeah.
What does that typically look like for a parent?
Yes. So what it typically looks like and what it can look like are different. We do see a lot of young kids because truly we believe very much in the power of early intervention. And I don't think we're alone in that. I'm sure you would agree. So we want to front load services as much as we can, especially with hearing technology. If the child is going to be accessing sound with hearing technology, there is a sensitive period for language acquisition. So we want to make sure what we're really doing with the babies, we're doing speech therapy is what we say, but really we're retraining the brain and we're teaching the baby's brain to listen. So when we have a very young baby, we're working with the parent to make sure they understand the strategies that they can use in their everyday routines to maximize their child's access to sound and to foster that language development. Our goal is for the language to develop in a developmental model, how it would for a typical child with typical hearing, perhaps delayed if we need to wait for a cochlear implant surgery or something like that, but for it to follow a developmental trajectory. That's not always the case if we get a late diagnosis. Also, 40% of children with hearing loss have another diagnosis. So, there can be a lot of confounding factors. So we work in whatever way works best for the family. Usually that means T-visits are in the family's home. It might be a parent in their pajamas or a nanny or a grandma. Anyone can come. I've done T-visits with other therapists because they might want to learn about the hearing loss piece. I've done them with siblings. And then, yes, we have a lot of kids with medical conditions that do require them to be hospitalized, and I'll do a T-visit right in the hospital, no problem. We can do them anywhere a child is.
You had mentioned that hearing loss and sometimes children have other things going on. Do you find that the hearing loss leads to other things, or do you find that the other things often lead to the hearing loss?
Actually, just say they co-occur more commonly. Sometimes hearing loss is part of a syndrome. It's one feature of a syndrome. There are several syndromes that have that. So the child was born with a syndrome, and hearing loss is one of the things that happens with that. Then we have other causes of hearing loss, such as congenital cytomegalovirus, which is beginning to be better understood and diagnosed more frequently, but it has to be diagnosed earlier. And the more we're learning about that, we see that it's more common for kids with CCMV to have ASD diagnoses, to have vestibular issues, etc. And then sometimes it's just that anything can happen and they're not related at all. Just like a kid who is born with typical hearing may have dyslexia or may have autism spectrum disorder, so too a child who is born deaf or hard of hearing may also have that. So I don't typically see it as causing or being caused by, but just that they co-occur.
Now, I remember very vividly being in the hospital, and the triplets were very early born and stuff like that, and I had all of these thoughts of what being in a hospital, and I didn't know what a NICU was. Talk to us a little bit about some of the myths that are out there about raising students that have hearing loss, working with young kids when you can't necessarily communicate with them. How can a parent best support their students to give them what they need and how they need it?
That's a great question. And that is when I often meet parents, is at that very fearful point. And it's a very vulnerable place for a parent to be, because all you want is the best for your child and you feel like you have no idea how to do that. And I hate that parents experience that, but I love meeting them in those moments, because our mission is to empower parents to know that they are doing everything they can to ensure that there are no limits for their child. And so what parents need to know, what the message I want to get to them when they get that diagnosis and they're sitting in the NICU or they're sitting home with their newborn baby who looks perfectly healthy but can't hear them, and they know that, but it doesn't quite make sense. I want them to know there are no limits for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. I want them to know that regardless of whether there's anyone in their community that has ever met a child who is deaf, which there may well not be, even if they live in a kind of large urban community, it's very piecemeal where you might get services because it's low incidence. None of that matters. If you want to access services for your child, you can, and your child can and will do anything. We can get them the technology they need. We partner with audiologists. You're going to need a big team. You're going to need a great pediatric audiologist. You're going to have to travel for that. Maybe not. That's going to be in person, but everything else you can get virtually, and you can learn to do everything your child needs.
Let's talk a little bit about that technology for a second, because this is where I'm fascinated with. I think, is the term hearing aid still an appropriate term these days? Is there another way of putting that? Is that what the device is that I'm trying to say the right words here, right?
So hearing aids are one kind of technology. Children typically have There's three main classes of hearing technology that our kids are going to use. Some children with a profound hearing loss or a severe hearing loss may need cochlear implants. So that requires a surgery. And so
that's permanent, right? Or it's
it's permanent in that, although you can take the external piece off and not use it. The internal part, yes, is permanent. But then they wear an external processor that looks kind of like a hearing aid. It just has an extra little piece, but they can take that off if they don't want to hear in that moment, or to sleep, things like that. Children do wear hearing aids, behind the ear hearing aids. That's kind of the traditional thing you think of, and what you see a lot more adults wearing are typically behind the ear hearing aids, where they have something in the ear and then a little something that hooks over it. And then children also use, and adults use, bone conduction hearing aids and bone conduction devices. That's if there is a problem in the outer or middle ear. So the inner ear, the cochlea, is working beautifully, no problem, right? So a cochlear implant won't help, but there's something blocking it. So perhaps the child has microtia and atresia. That's when a child is born with a very small, or looks like no ear, and the ear canal is closed. Or there's another problem in the middle ear. And that works by actually vibrating the bone in your head and sending the signal to our cochlea. And we all hear that way. We can all hear that way, and we can put an amplifying device on, a bone-anchored hearing aid on, and that will allow the child to hear typically. So there's a lot of different kinds of hearing technologies, and there's tons of add-ons too. So then we can use remote mics, we can direct connect, we can use all the fancy add-ons, and we do a lot of that in teletherapy.
So I want to start asking a couple of questions from the point of view of being a music teacher. And I know even with my own kids, we know better than to take them into large sports stadiums. We know better than to put them in a car and blast the radio. When you do have a situation where you're with a child that has a hearing
loss.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. What are some of the rules and guidelines for all of this? I mean, clearly you're not going to stick them in a NASCAR stadium, right? But I mean, is there a volume level that's too loud because they're hearing?
Good question.
That's the right question.
So the technology actually helps us here.
Okay.
So anywhere that a child of that age is going to be totally overwhelmed and they're going to hate it and have a meltdown, like that applies still.
Okay.
Right. But the hearing technologies that we use, the implants and the hearing aids, they will actually tamp down anything.
Really?
A very loud sound. They're very sophisticated digital instruments. They're very specific, and they tamp down the sound so that it cannot further damage the hearing.
And I would assume any device these days, you charge that every night? Or is it battery based these days?
You can do either, and it's typically the parent's choice whether they do rechargeables or batteries. The cochlear implants are more and more popular to be rechargeable. A lot of hearing aids still use batteries, but we're seeing more and more rechargeables as we go.
And so if a student does have a hearing aid, something that's detachable, that needs to get charged up, do families generally get multiple? I mean, now I'm thinking the student is sleeping at night and can't hear, God forbid, an emergency. How does all of that work?
They typically don't wear their devices at night, typically. So they would have, just like there are many children and adults who are deaf who do not wear hearing devices, who prefer not to. And there's a lot of safety features that are in place. So you can have fire alarms and phones and just your alarm that wakes you up. They can be flashing lights. They can vibrate the bed. There's a lot of things like that. So we've had that in place because we needed that in place before we had good technology for them to be able to hear, right? And it can still be used. Some people do prefer to sleep with one device in so they can still hear, and some people don't. It's kind of a personal preference. Once they're not babies, and they're not going to, it's not a choking hazard.
Let's jump back into the classroom for a second here. I've worked in classrooms where, as I walked in as an instructional coach, the teacher would give me a necklace, and that's how I'm communicating with the student. And usually what ends up happening is I forget I'm wearing it, and then you're walking down the hallway and you're having regular conversations, and the kids
they overhear a lot.
I know where you are. How can a teacher best support a student with hearing loss in their classrooms?
So if a teacher has a child who is deaf or hard of hearing in their classroom, they should definitely advocate for a couple services. We want the educational audiologist in there, and we want a teacher of the deaf. And many districts do not have that at the ready. Some of them do. A large district will likely have those professionals, but there is a critical shortage of teachers of the deaf nationwide. Those are people with a master's level degree, specialized in working with children who are deaf and hard of hearing. They can go into the classroom, work with the classroom teachers, make sure everybody on the team, including the instructional coaches, knows how to use the mic system and that it's working well. And they work on self-advocacy with the student and all of those kinds of great skills. If your district doesn't have that and they tell you we don't have that, that's actually not an acceptable answer. That is something that student is legally entitled to. And that's when I would strongly encourage you to reach out to any program locally to you or to Clarke, who can provide those via Teleservice to support the school team, because the teachers need support. They could be, you may be the best general education or special education teacher in the world, but you weren't trained in hearing loss. How could you have been? That's not your job. So someone should coach you and help you and support you in supporting your student, because we know what teachers want is to meet every student's need, and that's where we come in.
Are there certain activities that you would want to move towards or stay away from if you have somebody who has a hearing necklace and things, or just is the motto, just treat them like regular students? How do you?
In general, we treat them like regular students, but we want to be careful, right? So depending on what they're using, hopefully they're using some kind of DM system or an FM, it's a remote mic system, right? That's ideal. And that way the instructor is wearing it, but they need to work with the educational audiologist or the teacher of the deaf to learn when to turn that on and off. When do you mute it? Because if the kids are working in small groups, it's actually detrimental that needs to be muted at that time. And we may encourage other types of technologies in some classrooms where it's a lot of student participation. That might not be the best thing. Maybe a pass around mic is better. Maybe we need to make some modifications to the classroom just by adding curtains, by putting tennis balls on the chair legs to reduce the background noise. And then we want to think about preferential seating. And that doesn't always mean front and center. It depends on the child's specific hearing loss and needs and where the teacher stands, but sitting the child so they have optimal auditory access to the teacher. We're
going to make sure that all of the links are available. This is, of course, Digital Learning Today, episode number 31. You can find this over on teachercast.net/podcast. In addition, you can find all of our shows if you're looking for our Jeff Bradbury show or instructional tech coaching today. You can certainly find that as well. Now, I want to say thank you so much. One last time for anybody out there, where can we go to find out more information about the great thing happening over at Clarke?
You can go to clarkeschools.org. If you're specifically interested in T-Visit Teleservices, it's just clarkeschools.org/T-Visit. And you can email me and get a response from me personally, tvisit@clarkeschools.org.
And we want to say thank you to Clarke Schools for putting this show together, and thank you to Nell for being a guest on this. I hope you guys have a chance to come back on. I would love to continue this conversation, perhaps with other educators, or if you're out there as a parent and would love to be a part of this conversation, would love to have you guys as well. And that wraps up this episode of Digital Learning Today. On behalf of Nell and everybody here in TeacherCast, my name is Jeff Bradbury, reminding you guys to keep up the great work in your classrooms and continue sharing your passions with your students.
You've been listening to the TeacherCast Educational Network, hosted by Jeff Bradbury. Please reach out to the show with all of your questions on Twitter @TeacherCast or online at www.teachercast.net. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. And please take a moment to write a review in the App Store.